The photograph would later become evidence in a federal investigation, but that October evening, it merely sat on the mantelpiece among a dozen other family portraits. Sarah Chun noticed it during her first dinner at the Harrington estate. A seemingly innocent image of Marcus as a child, standing beside a woman who bore no resemblance to the elegant Mrs. Harrington currently serving wine. The woman in the photograph wore a simple uniform and held Marcus's hand with the tender familiarity of someone who had raised him. Sarah's art history training had taught her to observe details others missed, to question inconsistencies in provenance and presentation. But she couldn't have known that this particular skill would soon become the difference between life and death. The wrought iron gates of the Harrington estate parted with electronic precision as Marcus's Tesla wound up the tree-lined drive. Sarah pressed her palm against the passenger window, watching the manicured landscape unfold like something from a lifestyle magazine. Towering oaks created a cathedral of autumn colors overhead, their leaves filtering the late afternoon sun into golden coins that danced across the windshield. "You didn't mention your family lived in a mansion," she said, unable to keep the awe from her voice. Marcus glanced at her, his expression unreadable behind designer sunglasses. "It's just where I grew up. My parents are super chill, you'll see." The house materialized through the trees like a Georgian fantasy, all symmetrical windows and ivy-covered brick. Sarah had spent 3 years working at the Met, had walked through countless historic homes, but something about the Harrington estate felt different. Too perfect, perhaps. Too deliberately preserved. As they approached the circular drive, she noticed movement in one of the upper windows, a flash of white uniform, quickly withdrawn. A housekeeper, most likely, preparing for their arrival. The thought made her unconsciously smooth her dress, a vintage piece she'd found in a Chelsea boutique that Marcus had complimented on their second date. "Nervous?" Marcus asked as he killed the engine. "Should I be?" His laugh carried an edge she'd never heard before. "Of course not. They're going to love you." The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman in her early 60s with silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. Patricia Harrington wore a cream-colored sweater set that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, her smile perfectly calibrated for greeting her son's latest girlfriend. "Marcus, darling," she said, extending manicured hands. "And you must be Sarah. I've heard so much about you." The embrace was brief, patrician, a social ritual rather than genuine affection. Sarah caught a whiff of expensive perfume mixed with something else, something medicinal and sharp. "Mrs. Harrington, thank you for having me. Your home is beautiful. Please, call me Patricia. Come in, come in. Richard is in his study, but he'll join us for cocktails." The foyer soared 2 stories, dominated by a crystal chandelier that cast rainbow prisms across cream-colored walls. Sarah's trained eye cataloged the artwork, a small Monet water lily study, what appeared to be an authentic Degas pastel, several pieces that made her breath catch. Either the Harringtons had exquisite taste and unlimited funds, or they had inherited a collection worth millions. "Your art collection is remarkable," she said, pausing before a painting she recognized from auction catalogs. "Is that a Monet?" Patricia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Richard's passion, not mine. I'm afraid I find it all rather overwhelming. Would you care for some wine? Dinner won't be ready for another hour." They settled in a living room that belonged in Architectural Digest, all neutral tones and carefully arranged fresh flowers. Patricia poured wine from a bottle that Sarah recognized as a vintage Bordeaux worth at least $500. The casual extravagance felt performative, as if she were meant to be impressed. "So, Sarah, Marcus tells me you work at the Metropolitan Museum. How fascinating. What do you do there?" "I'm in the Provenance Research Department. I help authenticate works and trace their ownership history." Something flickered across Patricia's face, too quick to interpret, but unmistakably sharp. "How thorough of you. And time-consuming, I imagine." Before Sarah could respond, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Richard Harrington appeared in the doorway, a tall man in his mid-60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to deference. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced, but his pale blue eyes held an assessment that made Sarah's skin prickle. "So you're Sarah," he said, his gaze moving from her face to her dress to her hands. "Are you a housekeeper or something?" The question landed like a physical blow. Sarah felt heat rush to her cheeks, her carefully prepared small talk evaporating. Marcus stiffened beside her, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying a warning. "What?" "It's a reasonable question." She has that look. Patricia laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "Richard, don't be ridiculous. Sarah works at the Met. She's quite accomplished." But the damage was done. Richard's question hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the carefully orchestrated welcome. Sarah forced herself to smile, to appear unaffected, while her mind raced to process the casual cruelty. What look was he referring to? Her Asian features? Her vintage dress? The fact that she'd grown up in Queens instead of Greenwich? "I research art for a living," she said, keeping her voice level. "Though I suppose that might seem like housekeeping to some people. Cleaning up messy histories, organizing things that don't quite fit." Richard's laugh was sharp and mirthless. "How poetic. And how long have you been doing this housekeeping at the Met?" 3 years. Before that, I completed my PhD in art history at Columbia. The information seemed to register differently than she'd expected. Instead of grudging respect, Richard's expression grew more guarded. Patricia refilled everyone's wine glasses with unnecessary attention to detail, her movements betraying attention that hadn't been there moments before. "Columbia," Richard mused. "Expensive education. Good thing your parents could afford it. Actually, I received a full scholarship based on academic merit." Marcus finally found his voice. "Dad, maybe we could. I'm just getting to know our guest, son. Sarah seems like a very determined young woman. The type who doesn't give up easily when she wants something." The words carried implications that made Sarah's stomach tighten. She'd encountered her share of casual racism and classism, but this felt different, more targeted, as if Richard Harrington were trying to establish something specific about her character and motivations. A soft chime indicated that dinner was ready, providing a merciful interruption to the increasingly tense conversation. As they moved toward the dining room, Sarah caught sight of herself in a hallway mirror. She looked exactly as she always did, professional, composed, appropriately dressed for dinner at her boyfriend's family home. Whatever Richard Harrington saw when he looked at her existed entirely in his own prejudiced imagination. The dining room continued the theme of understated luxury, with a mahogany table that could seat 12 in oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors watching from gilt frames. Sarah found herself seated across from Patricia, with Marcus on her right and Richard at the head of the table like a judge preparing to render verdict. A woman in a white uniform, the same figure Sarah had glimpsed in the upstairs window, served the first course without making eye contact. She was perhaps 45, with dark hair pulled back severely and hands that moved with practiced efficiency. When she reached Sarah's place setting, their eyes met briefly, and Sarah caught something unexpected, a flash of recognition, almost like sympathy. "Rosa has been with us for 15 years, Patricia said, noticing the exchange. "An absolute treasure. We don't know what we'd do without her." Rosa's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she continued around the table. Sarah filed the interaction away, her researcher's instincts prickling. Everything about this dinner felt scripted, from Patricia's careful small talk to Richard's calculated provocations to Rosa's careful invisibility. "So, Sarah," Richard said as they began eating, "what's your specialty at the Met? I imagine you focus on a particular period or region." "Actually, my focus is on stolen or looted artwork. I help museums and private collectors verify that pieces in their collections were legally acquired." This time, there was no mistaking the look that passed between Richard and Patricia. It lasted only a second, but Sarah caught it. A moment of shared alarm quickly masked by renewed interest in their salads. "How noble," Patricia said. "It must be satisfying work, reuniting art with its rightful owners." "It can be, though sometimes the histories are more complicated than they initially appear. Pieces change hands multiple times, often under questionable circumstances. Following the paper trail can reveal some surprising connections." Marcus squeezed her hand under the table, but Sarah wasn't sure if the gesture was meant to be supportive or cautionary. The conversation continued through multiple courses, but beneath the surface pleasantries, she sensed currents of tension she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't until dessert was served that she noticed the photograph. The family portrait sat among several others on the sideboard, but something about it nagged at Sarah's trained eye. The composition was familiar, a formal pose of Richard and Patricia with a young Marcus, perhaps 8 years old, standing between them. But the woman beside Richard bore no resemblance to the Patricia currently serving coffee. This woman was younger, with dark hair and kind eyes, wearing what appeared to be a simple day dress rather than the designer clothes Patricia favored. "That's a lovely family photo," Sarah said, nodding toward the sideboard. "Marcus looks so young." Patricia followed her gaze, and for just a moment, her composure cracked. "Oh, that old thing. I should really have Rosa put it away. It's quite outdated." "Outdated how?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "It looks like it was taken maybe 15 years ago." "Something like that," Richard said dismissively. "Patricia, wasn't there something you wanted to show Sarah in the garden?" The lights fading. The subject change felt forced, but Patricia seized it gratefully. "Of course. Sarah, you must see the roses. They're quite spectacular this time of year." As they moved toward the French doors leading to the garden, Sarah caught Marcus's arm. "Who's the woman in that photograph?" "What photograph?" "The family portrait on the sideboard." "That's not your mother." Marcus glanced back toward the dining room, his expression carefully neutral. "You're mistaken. Of course it's my mother." But Sarah had spent years examining photographs for evidence of forgery and alteration. She knew what she'd seen. The woman in the photograph had different bone structure, different coloring, different everything from Patricia Harrington. Either it wasn't a family portrait at all, or the Harrington family had secrets they preferred to keep buried. The garden tour felt perfunctory, Patricia pointing out various flowering plants while checking her watch repeatedly. As they walked the gravel paths between perfectly manicured beds, Sarah noticed Rosa moving through the house, visible through lit windows. The housekeeper's presence seemed to follow them from room to room, as if she were monitoring their conversation. "You have a beautiful home," Sarah said, making another attempt at connection. "Have you lived here long?" "Oh, ages," Patricia replied vaguely. "Richard inherited it from his family. Old money, you know. Sometimes I think it would be nice to have something smaller, more modern, but Richard is sentimental about tradition." They'd circled back toward the house when Sarah noticed something that made her stop walking. Through the kitchen window, she could see Rosa standing at the sink, but she wasn't washing dishes. She was staring directly at them, her expression intense and urgent. When their eyes met through the glass, Rosa lifted one hand to her chest in what could have been a casual gesture or a deliberate signal. "Are you all right?" Patricia asked, following Sarah's gaze. "Fine, just admiring the kitchen. It looks so professional. Rosa keeps everything perfectly organized. We're very lucky to have her." But as they returned to the house, Sarah caught another glimpse of Rosa, this time in the hallway leading to what appeared to be servants' quarters. The housekeeper was no longer wearing her uniform. Instead, she wore jeans and a sweater, and she was carrying a small suitcase. The evening concluded with stilted small talk over coffee, Richard making pointed comments about the importance of young people understanding their place in established families. Sarah endured it with growing discomfort, increasingly certain that she was missing crucial context for everything she observed. As Marcus walked her to his car, she tried once more to address what she'd seen. That photograph in the dining room. "Sarah, you're imagining things. You've had a long day, and my parents can be overwhelming. That's all." But as they drove down the tree-lined drive, Sarah turned for a last look at the house. Rosa stood at an upstairs window, clearly visible in the light. As Sarah watched, the housekeeper held up a piece of paper against the glass, too far away to read, but unmistakably deliberate. Someone in the Harrington house was trying to communicate with her, and it wasn't Marcus's parents. The next morning brought unseasonably warm October weather and a text message that changed everything. Sarah was reviewing authentication reports in her Met office when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. "Rosa Delgado. I clean house for Harringtons. Need to talk. Very important. Meet me Riverside Park, 107th Street Bench, 1 p.m. today. Come alone." Sarah stared at the message, her coffee growing cold in her hands. Rosa had somehow obtained her phone number and was requesting a clandestine meeting. Every reasonable instinct told her to delete the text and forget about it. But her researcher's curiosity, honed by years of following obscure leads and unexpected connections, wouldn't let her dismiss it. At 12:45, she found herself walking through Riverside Park, questioning her judgment with every step. The bench at 107th Street overlooked the Hudson River, far enough from the main pedestrian areas to provide privacy. Rosa was already there, no longer the invisible domestic servant from the previous evening. In civilian clothes and away from the Harrington estate, she looked younger and more vital, her dark eyes alert and intelligent. "You came," Rosa said as Sarah approached. I wasn't sure you would. Your message was intriguing, though I have to ask how you got my phone number. Marcus left his phone on the kitchen counter while he was helping his father in the study. I saw your contact information. Sarah sat on the bench, maintaining careful distance. What did you want to tell me? For a long moment, Rosa stared across the water, her expression troubled. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had been keeping difficult secrets. The woman in the photograph, the one you asked about, that was Carmen Harrington, Marcus's real mother. The words hit Sarah like cold water. Real mother? But Patricia. Patricia is Richard's second wife. They married 8 years ago, when Marcus was 15. Carmen died the year before. Sarah felt the pieces of the previous evening's puzzle rearranging themselves into a completely different picture. Died how? Rosa's hands twisted in her lap. Officially? A fall down the stairs. But Carmen was careful, always careful. She wouldn't have fallen. You're suggesting she was murdered? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what I saw. Rosa's voice grew stronger, more determined. I was working late that night, preparing for one of Richard's business dinners. I heard them arguing in the study, Carmen and Richard. She'd found something, some papers. She was talking about going to the authorities. Sarah's professional skepticism warred with growing alarm. What kind of papers? I don't know exactly, but I know they had to do with the art collection. Carmen had been asking questions about where some of the pieces came from, how Richard had acquired them. She'd even contacted someone at your museum, the Met. The revelation made Sarah's breath catch. If Carmen Harrington had been researching the family's art collection through official channels, there would be records, correspondence, documentation that could be verified. The night she died, Rosa continued, I was in the kitchen finishing up when I heard a terrible crash. By the time I got to the main staircase, Richard was already there, calling 911. Carmen was at the bottom of the stairs, her neck. Rosa's voice broke. He said she tripped on the carpet runner. But I just vacuumed those stairs that afternoon. There was nothing to trip on. Did you tell the police what you suspected? Rosa's laugh was bitter. You think they would have listened to me? A housekeeper with no papers, no legal status? Richard Harrington is connected to half the political establishment in this state. One word from him, and I would have been deported before I could finish giving my statement. The legal implications were staggering, but Sarah forced herself to focus on what could be verified. You said Carmen was investigating the art collection. Do you know which pieces she was concerned about? Several of them. The Monet you noticed, definitely. Some drawings that Richard keeps in his private office. And there was a painting she was particularly worried about, something called Woman with Red Scarf. She said it had been stolen from a Jewish family during the war. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She knew that painting, had researched its provenance extensively during her doctoral work. Woman with Red Scarf, by Otto Steiner, had been looted by the Nazis in 1943 from the Goldberg family collection in Paris. The family had been searching for it for decades, and it was listed in several databases of stolen artwork. Where is that painting now? Hanging in Richard's private study. The room he never lets anyone enter. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching joggers and dog walkers pass along the riverside path. Sarah's mind raced through the implications of what Rosa had told her. If Richard Harrington was knowingly in possession of stolen artwork, it would explain his hostile reaction to learning about her job. It would also suggest that Carmen Harrington had died because she discovered her husband's criminal activities. There's something else, Rosa said quietly. After Carmen died, Richard had the house security system upgraded. Cameras everywhere, motion sensors, electronic locks on certain rooms. He said it was for protection, but it felt more like surveillance. And Patricia, she's not what she seems. What do you mean? Before she married Richard, she worked for an auction house in Switzerland. Very discreet, very exclusive. The kind of place that doesn't ask too many questions about where artwork comes from. I think Richard chose her specifically for her connections in that world. The full scope of what Rosa was describing began to take shape in Sarah's mind. Not just a single stolen painting, but an entire network of illegal art dealing, with Carmen Harrington as collateral damage when she got too close to the truth. Why are you telling me this now? Sarah asked. Rosa turned to face her directly, her expression fierce. Because Marcus is bringing you into this family, and I can see that you're not just going to smile and look pretty. You ask questions. You notice things. And Richard is getting nervous about that. Nervous how? This morning, after you left, he made several phone calls. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard your name mentioned. And he's been in his study all morning, moving paintings around. I think he's preparing to hide evidence. The situation was escalating faster than Sarah could process. If Rosa was right, then Richard Harrington saw her as a threat to his criminal enterprise. Her expertise in provenance research, combined with her relationship with Marcus, gave her both the knowledge and the access needed to expose him. What do you think I should do? Be very careful, Rosa said urgently. And if you decide to investigate this further, don't tell Marcus. I love that boy like he was my own son, but he doesn't know the truth about his father. And Richard will use that against both of you if he has to. Rosa stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. Carmen kept a safety deposit box that Richard doesn't know about. If something happens to me, the key is taped under the bottom drawer in my dresser. Box 247 at First National Bank on 82nd Street. Carmen was gathering evidence before she died. Real evidence. As Rosa walked away, leaving Sarah alone on the bench, the weight of the revelation settled over her like a heavy blanket. She'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple case of family tension. Carmen Harrington had been murdered for discovering her husband's involvement in art theft, and now Sarah found herself in the same position of knowledge that had proven fatal. The question was what to do with that knowledge, and how to stay alive long enough to act on it. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon in the Met's Provenance Research Database, following digital trails that confirmed her worst fears. Carmen Harrington had indeed contacted the museum's restitution department 8 months before her death, inquiring about proper procedures for reporting suspected stolen artwork. The inquiry had been handled by Sarah's predecessor, who had provided Carmen with detailed information about documenting and reporting looted Nazi art. Even more disturbing was what Sarah found when she cross-referenced the Harrington collection with international databases of stolen artwork. At least 6 pieces that she'd observed during dinner appeared on various watch lists. The family wasn't just wealthy collectors. They were operating a sophisticated network for trafficking stolen art. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Dinner again tonight? Parents want to get to know you better. Sarah stared at the message, her hands trembling slightly. The invitation felt less like social courtesy and more like a summons. Rosa's warning echoed in her mind. Richard was nervous about her, had been making phone calls about her. Going back to the Harrington estate could be walking into a trap. But if she declined, it would signal that she suspected something. And if Richard really was as dangerous as Rosa suggested, appearing suspicious could be fatal. Sure, she texted back. What time? 7 p.m. Dress nicely. Dad's inviting some business associates. The addition of other guests provided both comfort and concern. More witnesses meant less likelihood of immediate danger, but it also suggested that Richard wanted to assess her in front of people who mattered to his business operations. Sarah spent the early evening researching Richard Harrington's business connections and social circle. What she found painted a picture of old money intersecting with new opportunities. Harrington Holdings had investments in shipping, import-export businesses, and several art storage facilities. The kind of infrastructure that would make moving stolen artwork across international borders relatively simple. At 6:30, she called her colleague Jennifer at the Met. Jen, I need a favor. If you don't hear from me by tomorrow morning, I need you to contact the FBI's art crime team and give them this information. She quickly outlined what Rosa had told her and what her research had revealed. Jennifer listened with growing alarm. Sarah, if you really believe this family is involved in art theft and murder, you shouldn't be going there alone. Call the police now. I don't have enough evidence yet. Just suspicions and the word of an undocumented housekeeper. But if I can get proof, photographs of the paintings, documentation from Richard's study, then we'll have a real case. This is insane. You're not a detective, you're an art historian. I'm the only person who can identify stolen artwork on site and who has legitimate access to the house. If I don't do this, Richard Harrington will just move everything and disappear. The families who lost these pieces will never get them back. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. Promise me you'll be careful. And promise me you'll call if anything feels wrong. I promise. But as Sarah drove toward the Harrington estate for the second time in 2 days, she wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. The house looked different in the evening light, more imposing and fortress-like. Several expensive cars were parked in the circular drive, and lights blazed from multiple windows. Sarah could see figures moving about inside, the kind of elegant gathering that her world of academic conferences and museum openings had never quite prepared her for. Marcus met her at the door, looking strikingly handsome in a charcoal suit. But something in his expression seemed strained, as if he were playing a role that didn't quite fit. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing her cheek. But the gesture felt perfunctory, obligatory. "Thank you. How many people are here?" 6 couples, plus family. Dad's business partners and their wives. Very boring, but he insists these dinners are important for networking. As they entered the living room, Sarah recognized the atmosphere immediately. This wasn't a social gathering, it was a performance, with everyone playing carefully rehearsed parts. Richard Harrington held court near the fireplace, animated in conversation with several distinguished-looking men. Patricia moved through the group with practiced grace, ensuring drinks were refreshed and conversations flowed smoothly. And Rosa was nowhere to be seen. "Where's your housekeeper tonight?" Sarah asked as casually as possible. "Rosa?" Dad gave her the evening off. "We're using a catering service for tonight's dinner." The information sent a chill through Sarah's stomach. Rosa's sudden absence felt ominous, especially given her warning about Richard's increasing nervousness. "Sarah," Richard's voice boomed across the room. "Come meet some friends of mine." She found herself introduced to a collection of men whose names she immediately forgot but whose eyes she remembered. They assessed her with the same calculating attention Richard had shown the previous evening, as if she were a potential business opportunity rather than a person. "Sarah works at the Metropolitan Museum," Richard announced. "She's an expert in tracking down stolen artwork." The way he said it made her professional credentials sound almost accusatory. Several of the men exchanged glances that she couldn't interpret, but their renewed interest in her felt predatory rather than friendly. "How fascinating," said a silver-haired man with a slight European accent. "And what's the most valuable piece you've ever recovered?" "Actually, I focus more on research and documentation than recovery. But I've helped identify several works worth millions of dollars that were looted during World War II. The war was such a tragic time," another man said smoothly. "So much beautiful art scattered to the winds. It must be nearly impossible to track ownership after all these years. You'd be surprised. Paper trails are remarkably persistent, and new database technology makes connections that were previously impossible to establish. We're finding pieces that have been missing for decades." Sarah watched the faces around her as she spoke, noting micro-expressions and subtle tensions. These men were not art enthusiasts making polite conversation. They were professionals assessing a potential threat to their business operations. Dinner was announced, and Sarah found herself seated between Marcus and the European man with the accent, who introduced himself as Klaus Mueller. The placement felt strategic, designed to monitor her conversation and responses. The meal proceeded with the kind of careful choreography she was beginning to recognize as standard for the Harrington household. But tonight felt different, more tense, more watchful. Sarah realized she was being studied by every person at the table, her comments and reactions analyzed for signs of suspicion or knowledge. It wasn't until dessert was served that she understood why. Richard stood at the head of the table, wineglass in hand, as if preparing to make a toast. But instead of pleasantries, he looked directly at Sarah. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "About your work tracking stolen art. It occurs to me that your expertise might be useful for a project we're considering." Every instinct Sarah possessed screamed danger, but she forced herself to appear interested rather than alarmed. "What kind of project?" "Authentication services for private collectors. Very discreet, very well compensated. The kind of work that could be quite lucrative for someone with your credentials." It was an offer and a threat simultaneously. Join their operation or become their enemy. Sarah felt the weight of every gaze at the table, understanding that her response would determine not just her future relationship with the Harrington family, but possibly her survival. "That's an interesting proposition," she said carefully. "I need to know more about the specific services you'd require." Richard's smile was sharp as a blade. "Of course. Why don't you and I discuss it privately after dinner? I have some pieces in my study that might interest you." The invitation to Richard's private study, the room Rosa had specifically mentioned as containing stolen artwork, was exactly what Sarah needed to gather evidence. It was also, she realized, likely to be the last conversation she ever had. But Carmen Harrington had died trying to expose these crimes, and Rosa was risking deportation to reveal the truth. Sarah couldn't walk away now, not when she was this close to justice. "I'd be honored to see your collection," she said, meeting Richard's gaze directly. Around the table, she caught glimpses of satisfaction and calculation. The trap was set, and she was walking directly into it. The only question was whether she was clever enough to spring it on her own terms. After dinner, the other guests migrated to the garden for cigars and brandy, their laughter carrying through the French doors like the sound of another world. Sarah found herself alone with Richard in the main hallway, the house suddenly feeling cavernous and threatening around them. "My study is upstairs," Richard said, his voice perfectly cordial. "I keep my most precious pieces there, away from the casual observer." As they climbed the mahogany staircase, Sarah thought about Carmen Harrington falling down these same steps, her neck broken, her investigation into stolen art ending in what Richard had called an accident. The carpet runner Rosa had mentioned was indeed present, thick and well-secured, providing no reasonable explanation for how someone could trip and fall. "Here we are," Richard said, producing a key from his pocket to unlock a heavy oak door. "My private sanctuary." The study was smaller than Sarah had expected but densely packed with artwork. Her trained eye immediately cataloged several pieces she recognized from stolen art databases, 2 Picasso sketches, a small Van Gogh oil study, and there, hanging prominently behind Richard's desk, Otto Steiner's Woman with Red Scarf. The painting hit her like a physical blow. She'd seen photographs of it in archived documentation, had read the desperate letters from the Goldberg family seeking its return, but seeing it in person made the crime personal and immediate. This wasn't just stolen property, it was a family's heritage, ripped away during humanity's darkest hour and hidden in a rich man's private collection. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Richard said, noticing her attention. "Steiner was tragically undervalued during his lifetime. This piece has tripled in value just in the years I've owned it." "How long have you owned it?" "Oh, 15 years or so. I acquired it from a private dealer in Switzerland." Impeccable provenance, naturally. Sarah forced herself not to react to the obvious lie. The painting had been stolen in 1943 and had never been legally sold since then. Any paperwork claiming legitimate provenance would be forged. "It must have been expensive," she said, moving closer to examine the brushwork. "Worth every penny. Though I must admit, the market for certain types of artwork has become complicated in recent years. So many questions about wartime acquisitions, so many families making claims based on questionable evidence." Richard moved to pour himself a brandy from a crystal decanter, his movements casual but his attention focused entirely on Sarah's reactions. She realized this was a test. He was gauging whether she would recognize the stolen pieces and, more importantly, what she would do about it. "The provenance research process has definitely become more sophisticated," she agreed. "New databases make it possible to trace ownership histories that were previously impossible to verify. Yes, I imagine that creates difficulties for collectors who may have acquired pieces in good faith, only to discover years later that the paperwork was insufficient." Sarah turned to face him directly. "Actually, the law is quite clear about stolen property. Good faith purchases don't create legitimate ownership when the original theft can be documented. The rightful owners or their heirs have permanent claims to their property." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. How inconvenient for current collectors, especially those who might have invested significant amounts in building their collections. Justice often is inconvenient for people who benefit from injustice. The words hung in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. Richard sipped his brandy, studying her with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "You know," he said finally, "Carmen used to say things like that. Very idealistic. Very concerned with abstract concepts of justice. She never understood that the world is more complex than academic theories suggest." Sarah's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "Carmen sounds like she was a woman of principle. She was a woman who couldn't leave well enough alone. Always asking questions, always poking into matters that didn't concern her. Very much like someone else I've recently met." The threat was unmistakable now. Richard was telling her that Carmen had died for asking the same questions Sarah was asking, and that he was prepared to solve the problem the same way. "I can understand why that would be frustrating," Sarah said, moving slowly toward the door. "Some people just can't help being curious about things that seem inconsistent or suspicious." "Exactly. And sometimes that curiosity leads them into dangerous situations." Richard moved between Sarah and the door, no longer pretending to be a gracious host. His earlier charm had evaporated, replaced by something cold and calculating. "The thing is, Sarah, I've built something valuable here. A network of collectors and dealers who understand that certain questions shouldn't be asked, certain records shouldn't be examined too closely. It's taken years to establish these relationships, and I won't let anyone destroy them. Including your first wife? Richard's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of satisfaction, as if he were pleased that she understood the stakes. Carmen made her choice. She could have been a partner in something profitable and discreet. Instead, she chose to be an obstacle. I don't like obstacles. Sarah's mouth went dry. He was confessing to murder, confident that she would never leave the room alive to repeat what she'd heard. What makes you think I'm an obstacle? Your job, your expertise, your inconvenient moral compass. And most importantly, your access to databases and investigative resources that could cause serious problems for my associates and me. He moved closer, and Sarah caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, the same medicinal smell she'd noticed on Patricia the night before. But here's what I'm prepared to offer you, Richard continued. A very lucrative consulting arrangement. You authenticate pieces for my network, you keep quiet about provenance issues that might complicate ownership, and you become very wealthy very quickly. Think of it as choosing pragmatism over idealism. Sarah's mind raced through her options. The door was blocked, the house was full of Richard's business associates, and Marcus was somewhere downstairs, oblivious to his father's true nature. But she'd come here for evidence, and Richard was providing it in abundance. That's a generous offer, she said, reaching slowly into her purse. But I'm curious about the details of your operation. Smart girl. Always thinking like a researcher. Richard relaxed slightly, perhaps interpreting her question as interest rather than investigation. The network is quite sophisticated. We have sources in Europe who identify pieces coming onto the market with questionable provenance. Instead of letting them disappear into private collections where they can't be traced, we acquire them and find appropriate homes with collectors who understand discretion. And by appropriate homes, you mean people who don't ask questions about ownership history. Exactly. Everyone benefits. The sellers get paid. The buyers get beautiful artwork, and pieces that might otherwise be lost forever are preserved in excellent conditions. Sarah's fingers found what she was looking for in her purse, her phone, set to record audio. She'd activated it before entering the study, hoping to capture any incriminating statements. Richard's confession was already documented, but she needed more. What about families who are searching for stolen pieces? Doesn't their suffering matter? Richard's laugh was genuinely amused. Sarah, these people have been dead for 80 years. Their great-grandchildren are claiming ownership of pieces they've never seen, based on paperwork that may or may not be authentic. We're talking about ancient history. The Goldberg family is an ancient history. They're alive. They're still searching for their stolen artwork, and that painting behind your desk belongs to them. The moment the words left her mouth, Sarah knew she'd made a tactical error. Richard's expression shifted from condescending amusement to genuine danger. How do you know about the Goldbergs? It's my job to know. Woman with Red Scarf is in every database of Nazi-looted art in existence. Any legitimate researcher would recognize it immediately. And have you shared this recognition with anyone else? Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze. Not yet, but I will. Richard moved toward his desk, and Sarah saw him open a drawer. When his hand emerged, it held a pistol, small, expensive-looking, and undoubtedly effective at close range. I'm afraid that's not going to be possible, he said calmly. You see, you're going to have a tragic accident tonight. Perhaps you'll fall down the same stairs that claimed my dear Carmen. These old houses can be so dangerous for people who aren't familiar with them. Sarah's training as a researcher had never included preparation for moments like this, but her survival instincts kicked in with surprising clarity. She needed to keep Richard talking while she looked for an escape route or a weapon. You won't get away with it, she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. People know I'm here. If something happens to me, they'll investigate. Will they? A tragic accident during a dinner party, witnessed by 8 of the most respectable citizens in the county? Who's going to question their account of events? My colleague at the Met knows about your collection. I told her everything Rosa told me about Carmen's death. For the first time, genuine alarm flickered across Richard's features. Rosa talked to you? She saw me asking questions about the family photographs. She wanted to make sure someone knew the truth about what happened to Carmen. Where's Rosa now? The question sent ice through Sarah's veins. Rosa hadn't been given the evening off. She'd been eliminated as a potential witness. What did you do to her? Rosa is no longer a concern for anyone, Richard said matter-of-factly. Undocumented workers sometimes just disappear. It's tragic, but hardly unusual. The casual admission of a second murder crystallized Sarah's understanding of just how dangerous Richard Harrington truly was. He wasn't just an art thief. He was a killer who viewed human lives as obstacles to be removed when convenient. But Rosa's death also meant that the safety deposit box with Carmen's evidence was now Sarah's only hope of exposing the entire network. If she could survive the next few minutes, she might be able to retrieve the evidence and bring justice for both women who had died protecting it. "You made one mistake," Sarah said, backing toward the window behind Richard's desk. "What's that?" "You assumed I came here alone and unprepared." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Meaning?" Sarah pulled her phone from her purse, showing him the recording app that had been running throughout their conversation. "Everything you've said in the last 10 minutes is documented. If anything happens to me, it automatically uploads to a secure server that my colleague at the Met can access." It was a lie, but a convincing one. Richard's face went pale as he processed the implications. "Delete it," he said, raising the pistol. "Delete it now, or I'll kill you where you stand. If you kill me, you'll never know who else has access to the recording. But if you let me walk out of here, I might be willing to negotiate." "You're bluffing." "Am I? You've already admitted to murdering your wife and your housekeeper. Do you really want to risk having those confessions played in a courtroom?" For a moment, they stood frozen in a standoff, Sarah with her phone and Richard with his gun. Then footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the study, and Marcus's voice called out, "Dad? Sarah? Mom said you were looking at artwork." The interruption broke Richard's concentration for just a moment, but it was enough. Sarah lunged toward the window, her elbow connecting with the glass in a shower of broken shards. The alarm system immediately began shrieking, and lights flooded the garden below. "Sarah!" Marcus's voice was closer now, alarmed by the sound of breaking glass. Richard moved toward her, but the combination of the alarm and Marcus's approach made him hesitate. In that hesitation, Sarah saw her chance. She grabbed the Steiner painting from behind the desk, clutching it against her chest as she faced Richard. "If you shoot me, you'll have to explain to your son and your business associates why I'm dead in your study holding a painting that's supposed to be legally yours. Even if they believe your story, the police investigation will expose everything." The calculation in Richard's eyes was visible as he weighed his options. The study door rattled as Marcus tried the handle. "Dad? The door's locked." "What's going on?" "Nothing, son. Just a small accident. We'll be right out." But Sarah could see the desperation growing in Richard's expression. Too many variables were spiraling out of his control, and desperate men made dangerous choices. She needed to end this standoff before Richard decided that killing everyone in the house was his only option. The study door burst open as Marcus used his shoulder to force the damaged lock. He stumbled into the room, taking in the scene with growing horror, his father holding a gun, Sarah clutching a painting amid broken glass, and the wall safe behind the desk standing open with documents scattered across the floor. "What the hell is going on?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking with confusion and fear. "Your father has been stealing artwork for years," Sarah said quickly, before Richard could spin a cover story. "This painting was looted from a Jewish family during World War II. Your mother, your real mother, Carmen, found out about it and was going to turn him in. So he killed her." Marcus looked between them as if they were speaking a foreign language. "That's insane. Mom died in an accident." "And that's not—" He stopped, staring at the painting in Sarah's arms. "Wait, I remember this painting. It used to hang in Mom's bedroom, but after she died, Dad moved it up here. Because Carmen had researched its history and discovered it was stolen," Sarah continued. "She was gathering evidence to return it to the Goldberg family when your father murdered her." "Dad?" Marcus turned to Richard, his voice pleading. "Tell her she's wrong. Tell her this is all some kind of misunderstanding." Richard's face had gone ashen, but his grip on the pistol never wavered. "Marcus, son, you don't understand how complicated these things can be. Sometimes people make accusations based on incomplete information." "I have Carmen's research," Sarah said urgently. "Rosa told me where she hid the evidence before your father killed her too. Box 247 at First National Bank. Your mother documented everything, the stolen paintings, the network of dealers, all of it." "Rosa?" Marcus looked genuinely bewildered. "Dad said Rosa went back to Mexico to take care of her sick mother." "Rosa is dead," Sarah said bluntly. "Just like Carmen. Your father eliminates anyone who threatens to expose his crimes." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Sarah watched his face cycle through denial, confusion, and growing horror as the implications sank in. "This can't be true," he whispered. "Dad, tell me this isn't true." Richard's expression softened as he looked at his son, and for a moment, Sarah glimpsed the man Marcus had grown up believing his father to be. Marcus, everything I've done has been for this family. To protect our legacy, to ensure your future. Sometimes that requires making difficult choices. Difficult choices? Marcus's voice rose. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about survival. About protecting what we've built from people who would destroy it based on idealistic notions of justice that ignore practical realities. Sarah realized that Richard was genuinely trying to justify his actions to his son, as if mass murder were simply a business strategy that Marcus should understand and accept. The twisted logic revealed the depth of Richard's sociopathy. But Marcus was backing away from his father, his face pale with revulsion and disbelief. You killed my mother, he said, the words barely audible. You killed Carmen, and you let me believe it was an accident for 8 years. Carmen was going to destroy everything, Richard said desperately. She was going to contact the FBI, turn over our client lists, expose our entire network. We would have lost everything, the house, the business, our social position, everything that makes our lives possible. So you murdered her. I protected our family. The shout echoed through the study, and Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway as the dinner guests began investigating the commotion. Richard seemed to realize that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Marcus, you need to understand. I understand that you're a monster, Marcus interrupted, his voice growing stronger with each word. I understand that you killed the only mother I ever knew and then brought Patricia into our house to help you cover it up. Sarah's breath caught as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Patricia knows, doesn't she? She's not just your wife, she's your partner in this operation. Richard's silence was answer enough. Patricia had indeed been chosen for her connections in the art world and her willingness to participate in illegal activities. The dinner party tonight, Sarah continued, all those men, they're part of your network. You were showing me off like a trophy, weren't you? Proof that you could neutralize any threat, even someone from the Met who specialized in recovering stolen art. You were supposed to take the job offer, Richard said, genuine frustration in his voice. You were supposed to be smart enough to choose money over principles. Like Patricia did? Patricia understands that survival requires pragmatism. She understands that the world is divided between people who take what they want and people who let things be taken from them. Voices were growing closer in the hallway, and Sarah could hear Patricia's voice among them, probably trying to keep the dinner guests calm while figuring out how to contain the situation. It's over, Dad, Marcus said quietly. Even if you kill both of us, too many people know now. Sarah's colleague at the museum, the FBI, the families who are searching for their stolen artwork, they'll all keep investigating until the truth comes out. Richard looked at his son with something resembling pride, as if Marcus's logical assessment of the situation demonstrated admirable analytical skills. You're right, of course. Which means we need to implement the contingency plan. What contingency plan? But Richard was already moving toward his desk, pressing something underneath the surface. Sarah heard a mechanical whirring sound, and the wall safe began to close automatically. Insurance, Richard said calmly. If the network is compromised, we eliminate the evidence and disappear. Patricia and I have been prepared for this possibility for years. You're talking about running away? I'm talking about survival. We have accounts in non-extradition countries, new identities, a complete escape plan. You can come with us, or you can stay here and deal with the consequences of tonight's revelations. Sarah realized that Richard had been planning for exposure from the beginning. The stolen artwork, the murdered witnesses, the carefully constructed network, it had all been designed with an exit strategy that would allow the principal players to disappear while leaving their victims without justice or closure. What about all the families searching for their stolen property? She asked. What about the people who deserve to recover their heritage? Richard's smile was genuinely pitying. My dear Sarah, those people lost their property 80 years ago. They've survived this long without it. They'll continue to survive. The artwork will find new homes with people who can appreciate and preserve it properly. The casual dismissal of human suffering revealed everything Sarah needed to know about Richard Harrington's character. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a man who viewed other people's pain as irrelevant to his own comfort and success. But the sound of footsteps in the hallway was getting closer, and Sarah realized that Patricia and the dinner guest would soon be at the study door. Once that happened, the narrative would shift to Richard's advantage. He would become the victim of a disturbed woman's accusations, with 8 respectable witnesses to support his version of events. Marcus, she said urgently, I need you to call the FBI art crime team right now. Tell them everything you've heard tonight. and give them the location of Carmen's safety deposit box. I can't. You can, and you have to. Your father is planning to escape the country, which means all the evidence will disappear with him. This is your only chance to get justice for your mother. Marcus looked at his father, his expression tortured. Dad, please. Just turn yourself in. Tell the truth about what happened to Mom. Maybe if you cooperate. Marcus, don't be naive. The federal government doesn't negotiate with people in my position. Our only option is to leave the country and start over somewhere else. Our option? You're my son. You're part of this family, whether you like it or not. If you stay here, you'll be investigated, prosecuted, possibly imprisoned as an accessory. Is that really what you want? Sarah watched Marcus struggle with the impossible choice his father was forcing on him. Stay and face potential prosecution for crimes he'd never committed, or flee the country with a murderer and abandon any chance of justice for his mother. But before Marcus could respond, the study door opened and Patricia entered, her elegant composure intact despite the chaos. Richard, darling, our guests are concerned about the alarm and the broken window. Perhaps we should, she stopped, taking in the scene. Oh, I see we've reached the crisis point. Patricia knows everything, Sarah said to Marcus. She's been helping your father run the network since they got married. Patricia's laugh was genuinely amused. Of course I know everything, dear. Who do you think helped Richard expand the operation beyond simple collecting? My contacts in Switzerland and Geneva have been invaluable for moving high-value pieces discreetly. The casual admission stunned Sarah. Patricia wasn't just Richard's accomplice, she was his partner in building an international art theft ring. You helped him kill Carmen, Marcus said, his voice hollow. Carmen was going to destroy something beautiful, Patricia replied calmly. She couldn't appreciate the artistry of what Richard had created. Sometimes preservation requires sacrifice. Sarah realized that both Richard and Patricia were sociopaths who viewed murder as simply another business tool. The depth of their callousness was breathtaking. But Patricia's arrival also meant that time was running out. Within minutes, the dinner guests would demand explanations, and Sarah would find herself facing 8 witnesses prepared to support whatever story the Harringtons told. She had one card left to play, and it was time to use it. Actually, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tense silence, there's something you should know before you make any final decisions. She held up her phone, showing the active recording app that had been documenting everything since she'd entered the study. But more importantly, my colleague Jennifer at the Met didn't just receive information about your collection. She received instructions to contact the FBI if I didn't check in by midnight tonight. It's currently 11:47 p.m. Patricia and Richard exchanged a look of genuine alarm. You're lying, Richard said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. The FBI art crime team has been investigating reports of stolen artwork in private collections throughout the Northeast. When Jennifer calls them with the information I provided, including the address of this house and the specific pieces you have in your collection, they'll obtain emergency warrants and be here within hours. Sarah was partially bluffing, but she could see the impact her words were having. Richard and Patricia had spent years building their network in secret, confident that their social connections would protect them from investigation. The possibility of federal agents arriving at their door was clearly not something they'd adequately planned for. Even if that's true, Patricia said smoothly, we'll be long gone by morning. Our contingency plan doesn't require days of preparation. With what transportation? Sarah asked. The FBI will have alerted TSA and Customs within an hour of receiving Jennifer's call. Your names will be flagged at every airport and border crossing in the country. Marcus looked at his father with growing understanding. That's why you kept pushing me to get a pilot's license, isn't it? So we'd have access to private aircraft that aren't monitored as closely. Richard's silence confirmed the accusation. Even his relationship with his son had been manipulated to serve his criminal enterprise. Marcus, Sarah said urgently, you need to decide right now whether you're going to be part of their escape plan or part of the solution. Because in about 10 minutes, 8 dinner guests are going to demand an explanation for what's happening in this room. She could hear voices gathering in the hallway outside. Patricia's carefully orchestrated dinner party dissolving into confusion and concern. Soon, someone would call the police about the alarm system, or demand to know why the study door had been locked, or simply insist on leaving because the evening had become too strange to continue. Marcus, son, Richard said desperately, you have to understand. I understand that you murdered my mother, Marcus interrupted, his voice stronger than Sarah had heard it all evening. I understand that you've been lying to me for 8 years. And I understand that you're asking me to become an accessory to murder and art theft. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking but his voice steady. "I'm calling the FBI. If you make that call, you'll destroy your own life," Patricia said coldly. "You've lived in this house, benefited from Richard's business activities, attended expensive schools paid for with money from stolen artwork. Do you think the FBI will view you as an innocent victim?" Sarah watched Marcus falter, the implications of Patricia's words sinking in. Even if he hadn't known about his father's crimes, he had indeed benefited from them his entire life. The legal system might not distinguish between willing and unwilling participation. "That's exactly why you need to cooperate with the investigation," Sarah said quickly. "If you help the FBI recover the stolen artwork and expose the network, they'll treat you as a cooperating witness rather than an accomplice. And if I don't cooperate, then you'll be viewed as part of the conspiracy, whether you knew about it or not." Richard moved closer to his son, the pistol still in his hand but no longer pointed directly at anyone. "Marcus, these people don't care about justice. They care about careers and headlines. They'll sacrifice you to make themselves look good, and you'll spend the best years of your life in federal prison, while you escape to live comfortably on money stolen from Holocaust victims." The question hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be defended or denied. Sarah saw the moment when Marcus finally understood the full moral weight of his father's crimes. Not just theft or even murder, but participation in the ongoing trauma of families who had already lost everything to genocide. "I can't," he said quietly. "I can't be part of this anymore." He began dialing, but Richard moved faster than Sarah had expected. The older man lunged toward his son, trying to grab the phone, and in the struggle, the pistol discharged. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, and for a moment, everyone froze. Then Sarah realized that the bullet had struck the window behind her, sending the remaining glass showering into the garden below. "Enough!" Patricia's voice cut through the chaos. "The guest will have heard that shot. We have maybe 2 minutes before someone calls the police." She moved to a painting on the wall, a small Renoir sketch that Sarah hadn't initially noticed, and swung it aside to reveal a wall safe. Her fingers flew over the combination, and within seconds, she was pulling out passports, cash, and what appeared to be a small hard drive. "Richard, we're leaving. Now. With or without Marcus." But Richard was staring at his son with an expression of profound loss, as if he were watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said quietly. "When I acquired the first piece 20 years ago, it was just an opportunity that presented itself. One painting, from a dealer who wasn't asking the right questions. But then there were more opportunities, and more connections, and before I knew it, before you knew it, you were running an international art theft ring and murdering anyone who threatened to expose you," Sarah finished. Richard looked at her with something resembling gratitude, as if he appreciated having his crimes stated so clearly and without euphemism. "Yes," he said simply. "That's exactly what happened." The admission seemed to drain something essential from him. The confident, threatening man who had held her at gunpoint minutes earlier was replaced by someone who looked older, smaller, and infinitely tired. "Dad," Marcus said, his voice breaking, "it's not too late. You could still." "It is too late," Patricia interrupted, stuffing documents into a leather bag. "It's been too late since the moment your girlfriend decided to play detective instead of taking the job offer." She looked at Sarah with genuine anger, as if Sarah were responsible for destroying something precious rather than exposing something criminal. "You could have been wealthy, respected, part of something exclusive and profitable. Instead, you chose to be a self-righteous crusader, and now everyone's lives are ruined." "Everyone's lives were already ruined," Sarah replied. "Carmen's, Rose's, all the families searching for their stolen heritage. I just made sure the people responsible would face consequences." Patricia's laugh was bitter. "Consequences? We'll be living comfortably in a non-extradition country within 12 hours. The only people facing consequences are the ones staying behind." She was right, and Sarah knew it. Even if the FBI moved quickly on Jennifer's information, Richard and Patricia had clearly spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. They would disappear into new identities while their victims remained robbed of both property and justice. But as Patricia moved toward the door with her bag of escape materials, Marcus stepped in front of her. "I can't let you leave," he said quietly. "Marcus, don't be foolish. You can't stop us, and trying will only make things worse for you. Maybe, but I can't spend the rest of my life knowing that I let my mother's killers escape." Sarah realized that Marcus had made his choice, not the pragmatic choice that would protect his own interests, but the moral choice that would honor his mother's memory. It was going to cost him everything, but he was willing to pay that price. "Son," Richard said, his voice pleading, "please don't do this to yourself. You can still come with us. We can be a family again, somewhere else." "We were never a family," Marcus replied. "A family doesn't murder each other for money." The sound of sirens in the distance indicated that someone had indeed called the police about the gunshot. Within minutes, the house would be surrounded by law enforcement, and the carefully orchestrated dinner party would become a crime scene. Patricia moved toward the window, apparently planning to escape through the garden, but Sarah realized she still had one more card to play. "The Goldberg family will finally get their painting back," she said, clutching the Steiner piece against her chest. "After 80 years, Woman with Red Scarf is going home." Richard looked at the painting in her arms, and for the first time that evening, his expression showed genuine pain rather than calculation or anger. "That was Carmen's favorite piece," he said quietly. "She used to sit in front of it for hours, studying the brushwork. She said the woman in the painting looked sad, as if she were waiting for someone to take her home." The irony was devastating. Carmen had fallen in love with a stolen painting without knowing its history, and her emotional connection to it had ultimately led her to discover the truth about her husband's crimes. "She was waiting," Sarah said softly. "The woman in the painting, the Goldberg family, all the families searching for their stolen heritage. They've all been waiting for someone to bring them home." Richard nodded slowly, as if accepting a judgment he'd been avoiding for years. "I know," he said. "I've always known." 6 months later, Sarah stood in a conference room at the FBI's New York field office, watching as agents cataloged the final pieces recovered from the Harrington network. The investigation had expanded far beyond a single family's crimes, exposing an international ring that had trafficked stolen artwork for over 2 decades. Marcus sat across from her, looking older than his 23 years but more at peace than she'd seen him since that terrible night at the estate. His cooperation with federal investigators had indeed protected him from prosecution, though the emotional cost of testifying against his father would follow him for years. "The last of the repatriations will be completed next month," Agent Martinez told them, reviewing a thick file of case updates. 47 pieces returned to their rightful owners or their heirs, including the Steiner painting that started this whole investigation. Sarah nodded, thinking about the ceremony she'd attended the previous week when Woman with Red Scarf was finally returned to Rachel Goldberg, the 90-year-old granddaughter of its original owners. The old woman had wept when she saw the painting, recognizing it from childhood memories of her grandparents' Paris apartment before the war. "What about Richard and Patricia?" Marcus asked quietly. "Still fighting extradition from Switzerland," Martinez replied. "But the Swiss authorities are cooperating fully. They'll be back in the U.S. within 6 months to face charges." Richard and Patricia had indeed escaped the country, using private aircraft and forged documents to reach a non-extradition haven. But their network of criminal contacts had been thoroughly compromised by the FBI investigation, leaving them isolated and increasingly desperate. Eventually, they'd made the mistake of trying to sell artwork in Switzerland, where alert customs officials had recognized pieces from the FBI's stolen art database. "And Rosa?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Martinez's expression grew somber. "We found her remains in a construction site about 20 miles from the estate." Richard had confessed to her murder during his initial interrogation in Switzerland, hoping for a plea deal. The news still hit Sarah like a physical blow. Rosa Delgado had risked everything to expose the truth about Carmen's death, and her courage had ultimately cost her life. But her information had been crucial to breaking the case, and her sacrifice had led to justice for dozens of families who had been searching for their stolen heritage. "There is some good news about Rosa," Martinez continued. "She had been sending money to her family in Mexico for years. We've been able to connect them with immigration lawyers who are helping her 2 children obtain legal status in the U.S. Rosa always dreamed of bringing them here for better opportunities. It wasn't enough to compensate for Rosa's death, but it was something away for her sacrifice to create the kind of future she'd wanted for her family." As they left the federal building, Marcus and Sarah walked together toward the subway station. Their romantic relationship had ended the night of the dinner party, destroyed by the weight of everything they'd discovered, but they'd maintained a friendship based on shared trauma and mutual respect. "I've been thinking about going back to school," Marcus said as they waited for the train. "Maybe law school, focusing on restitution issues." There are so many families still searching for stolen artwork and not enough people working to help them. Sarah smiled, recognizing Carmen's idealism living on in her son. Your mother would be proud. I hope so. I hope she'd understand why I chose to testify against Dad instead of protecting him. Marcus, you chose justice over loyalty to a criminal. That's exactly what Carmen was trying to do when she was killed. You finished what she started. The train arrived, and as they found seats, Sarah reflected on how the case had changed her own perspective on her work. She'd always viewed provenance research as an academic exercise, a matter of historical accuracy and legal ownership. But her experience with the Harrington family had shown her the human cost of art theft. Not just the economic loss, but the cultural trauma and emotional devastation that rippled through generations. What about you? Marcus asked. Any changes in your plans? Actually, yes. The Met is creating a new position focused specifically on Nazi-looted art recovery. I'll be working directly with families and law enforcement to identify and repatriate stolen pieces. It's going to be challenging work, but also meaningful. Because of what happened with my family. Because of what happened to your mother and Rosa and all the families who are still waiting for their stolen heritage to come home. Someone needs to advocate for them, and I want to be part of that effort. As the train carried them back toward Manhattan, Sarah thought about the photograph that had started everything. The image of young Marcus with a woman who wasn't Patricia, a woman whose questions had led to murder and whose death had ultimately led to justice. Carmen Harrington had died trying to return stolen artwork to its rightful owners. Her courage had inspired Rosa to seek justice despite the personal risk. And Rosa's sacrifice had enabled Sarah to expose a criminal network that had operated with impunity for decades. The chain of courage stretched from one woman to another, each person choosing to do what was right despite the personal cost. It wasn't the kind of dramatic heroism celebrated in movies, but it was the kind of quiet moral courage that actually changed the world, one recovered painting at a time. As Sarah prepared to begin her new position at the Met, she knew she would carry the memory of Carmen and Rosa with her. They had paid the ultimate price for their commitment to justice, but their sacrifice had created a legacy that would help reunite hundreds of families with their stolen heritage. The woman in the red scarf was finally home, and so were dozens of other pieces of stolen art. It wasn't enough to undo the damage of genocide and theft, but it was a beginning. A recognition that some crimes echo through generations, and that justice, however delayed, is always worth pursuing. Outside the train window, New York City flashed past in a blur of lights and movement, carrying within its museums and galleries countless stories of art and loss, crime and recovery. Sarah's new job would involve investigating those stories, following paper trails and provenance documents to their logical conclusions, no matter how uncomfortable those conclusions might be for current owners. She thought about Richard Harrington's question from that first dinner party. Are you a housekeeper or something? In a sense, she supposed she was. She cleaned up messy histories, organized things that didn't quite fit, and restored order to chaotic situations. But unlike the casual racism behind Richard's original question, Sarah's work as a housekeeper served justice rather than personal comfort. She helped return stolen property to its rightful owners, honored the memory of victims, and ensured that criminals faced consequences for their actions. It was demanding work, sometimes dangerous work, but it was also deeply meaningful work. And as the train carried her toward a new chapter in her career, Sarah felt grateful for the opportunity to continue Carmen and Rosa's fight for justice. One recovered painting, one reunited family, one exposed criminal at a time. The perfect family had been revealed as a lie built on theft and murder. But from the wreckage of that lie, something true and valuable had emerged. A renewed commitment to justice, a deeper understanding of art theft's human cost, and the knowledge that ordinary people could choose extraordinary courage when confronted with evil. It was a lesson worth remembering, and a legacy worth preserving.